So the first thing is actually defining democracy. There's a little bit of discussion about what we meant by democracy and if it was American democracy in the chat. So for the purpose of this conversation, democracy is how I'm defining it, and we can debate that if y'all would like. But as an informed participating electorate coming to consensus by way of a free and fair election. And so for this conversation, prompted by the question, what does democracy need now? I just want to talk about some of the parameters of the problems people are discussing. People want to discuss the presence of those problems and the actual impact of those problems, that's fine. But I was hoping it could be a practical, action-oriented conversation. So I also want to mention that what I was thinking was that it would be American democracy and American problems in particular, though of course every contribution is welcome. So the first part of that democratic definition is an informed and participating public. And there's a few issues that we've seen. One is with the informed part. Mis, dis, and malinformation are rampant and are extremely arguably problematic with people being informed and making free choices because it's argued that perhaps they don't have as free a mindset with incredibly sophisticated targeted marketing, a la carte propaganda services like we saw in the 2016 election, foreign involvement in these types of campaigns. It's arguable that it's very difficult to make free and informed choices if we're not actually given the information to make free and informed choices, and our minds are being corrupted by these savvy techniques. And then I'd also argue that there's a lack of political literacy, meaning perhaps not all Americans know really what political levers to be pulling in order to make things happen. I don't know if the responsibilities and roles and powers of all of the aspects of our government are delineated appropriately in the minds of the American public. I don't know if they know what actual roles and responsibilities fall within the courts and Congress and the office of the presidency. So I think that may be also a persistent problem. Also, lack of media literacy. There may be a digital divide and a cultural and age divide here, but being able to critically interpret media to know when it's constructed to gain some sort of emotional or solicit an emotional response or be persuasive in a particular way that's not necessarily rooted in something that's fact-based or is not inherently logical, I think is also a problem. And then lack of unbiased media sources. The internet has just absolutely enabled anyone to put up a website, claim that they're a news organization, and put out whatever content that they'd like. There's also the mechanism for informing the public. We've seen increase in the attacks on reputation and freedom of the media and educational institutions, and that may either coincide with or be responsible for a subsequent declining in trust in these institutions. There's also been instances of certain news organizations being banned from political events and rallies of the current president. Now, the other aspect of this is the participation. There's been reports of low desires to participate. Some of the arguments I've seen from people who were interviewed, they were saying things like their vote doesn't count or doesn't matter, or that they think that the election is rigged. There's no point in participating. This seems to be particularly young people. And then there's the inability to easily participate that has to deal with, voter suppression and resources at the polls, how quickly people can vote, it not being a federal holiday, many other different types of voter intimidation and suppression techniques. And there's also the impact of participation. If you live in a gerrymandered district that's like heavily gerrymandered, the district may not actually be as competitive as perhaps it arguably should be. So in terms of this aspect of democracy, being informed and participating, these are all the problems that I see. And please feel free to jump in and add any more that you may see that we're kind of grappling with today. As for the free and fair election part, with how free an election is, it can be a very high cost to run. You practically have to be in someone's pocket or be independently wealthy in order to run a campaign, especially at the state or federal level. And there's also costs to participate. Like we mentioned, there's no federal holiday for voting. There's long voting lines sometimes. There's ID requirements. And I don't necessarily mean that you need an ID to vote. I personally think that's a great idea, but things like parameters on when your ID will expire. If it expires in the same year, then you can't vote with that ID, for example, is arguably unfair, and it costs something to be in compliance with those types of regulations. And then there's the fairness of elections. Dr. Larry Lessig of Harvard, he did a TED Talk about this, and he mentioned tweetism. This was a political, I'm not sure if he was a political scientist or just some sort of political advisor, but essentially he said, I don't care who who wins the election as long as I control the nomination process. So this kind of goes into the dual party system about how, you know, Americans don't necessarily have a completely free and open choice as to who they're electing unless they want to write people in, because there's this whole process of nominations, and we're given this false dilemma of who we can choose to vote into various positions. And right now, the election for the presidency is most present in mind. There's also the control of private interest. This kind of goes into the high cost of running, you know, and being in someone's pocket. There's a degree to which if a corporation or company is contributing a lot to your campaign, then you may be compelled to submit legislation and policy that's of their interest, and you're not necessarily fairly representing the electorate that you were hypothetically elected to represent. Other voter suppression tactics, as I mentioned. And then, of course, there's also foreign interests. I believe in 2016, there was a bill introduced to the floor about transparency regulations around foreign investment and foreign support, and that was something that was killed. And I believe, I can't remember the bill it was that happened last year, perhaps, but it was also stricken. The existing transparency regulations, and I have this in a map that I posted already in Discord, has also been stricken from that bill when it was up to being passed again. And then there's also, when it comes to free and fair elections, how functional they are. So with election security, for example, I can potentially walk into a voting booth and unplug the voting machine, and that can delete all of that data. This was something that was brought up at a few hacker conferences in the past few years about how insecure and how potentially easy it is to corrupt the actual voting machine itself and delete data and even hack it and replace it with your own data. So that's another challenge, even though I don't know how widespread that is actually being implemented. And then there's also the aspect of the ability to come to consensus. So polarization is on the rise. Oftentimes we'll find in media, there's this idea of a false dilemma. It's a logical fallacy that's posed to people where they think they may only have two choices, like, well, what's more dangerous, terrorism or climate change? So that just kind of creates this paradigm in people's minds where they think that they have only these two choices, and that's actually false. There's also, I think, something that we're dealing with is the inability to handle complexity or the oversimplification of certain problems. Based on the work that I do, which is we work with I founded a nonprofit organization, and the work that we do is we map the complexity of social and political issues by mapping the arguments and claims and evidence from all points of view on social issues. So for climate change, for example, we found there was about 220 subtopics of debate, and each one of those at least implies two positions and tens of thousands of arguments and claims and pieces of evidence each. So that's like a massive conversation to collectively have. And it doesn't appear as though we have the existing tools to manage that complexity. So instead we, simplify things to sound bites and little pithy statements instead of really grappling with the complexity of our social issues. And that's not just climate change. I would argue that most persistent and polarized social issues are extremely complex, even when it comes to getting on the same page in terms of how we define certain things. And then not being braced or briefed due to complexity. So I don't think there's many institutions, whether that's media institutions, educational institutions. I would hope that they definitely brace and brief people for complexity, but that's not accessible to everybody. But even like the means of like hosting debates and putting forth documentaries, they tend to try and simplify and package up neatly the arguments from one point of view or another, instead of just diving into how complex things are. And maybe that's just because people by and large don't have the time or the cognitive ability to handle that complexity. I'm not sure. That's not my field. There's also the rural and urban divide. Thanks, Dave Troy, for bringing that up in the channel earlier. And then there's the fragmented media ecosystem as well, which includes the digital divide. So those are the three components that I see that make up a democracy, and those are the problems that I see within each one of those components that are challenges that we're currently grappling with. And so my question was, what does democracy need now? What does it need technologically, culturally, institutionally, politically? People have proposed apps, or we should have fact-checking standards, or there should be mass demonstrations. There should be some third-party candidate who's pushing for these changes. There should be some legislation. We should change the educational institution. And so I was really hoping to have a practical, grounded conversation about what's most feasible and what's the most impactful lever that we could pull to start addressing some of these issues. It's certainly something that I care about and I've dedicated my life towards working towards. So posing this question to the rest of you, because I'd imagine you're here because you're also interested. And then just to give a heads up, some common answers I've heard is, if only X group could vote, that would solve everything. If only we abolished the Electoral College, that would solve everything. If only X people were in power, that would solve everything. If only we banned these people's ideas online. Or if only we had some new system like digital voting or liquid democracy, that would solve everything. And I think that's a great point of discussion, any of these things, because there's ideas about how feasible and impactful these things could actually be. But that's all I wanted to say. And then I was hoping we could have a conversation about what does democracy need now. So thanks. And I don't know how to escape.
Jamie, is there it seems like you listed a few different topics. Do you want to go one by one? It might be easier. I don't know. Is there one that you want to start with?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I guess we could start with having an informed and participating public. And so I can go back to the problems there. So for an informed and participating public, there was the informed part, which is the mis, dis, malinformation, lack of political literacy, like actually knowing how the system works, to know where to put energy. If everyone's ideas and eyeballs are on the office of the president and they don't realize that some of these issues could actually be resolved at a hyper-local level, what could resolve that problem so that the actual problems could get solved. Lack of media literacy, the ability to critically interpret the media and know when someone's being BS'd or manipulated or not, the lack of unbiased media. Then the issues of attacks on the reputation of media, and then participation, which is the turnout issues, essentially.
I guess, people have talked a lot in the medical world about how we do these tests, maybe every 2 years, and how, how the world would be different if we could do these tests every day. And I guess I'm wondering if social media has a role in sort of exposing maybe some of the stories and ideas you're taking apart. I look at Twitter feeds of well-known politicians, and sometimes I wish there were a little, do you agree with this, or is this true or false, voting record right under there. And I know it would be spammed to the nth degree, but it would be very interesting to see if 80% of people agree with it versus if 40% agree with it versus if 10% agree with it. And I'm kind of wondering about taking that idea of democracy or referendum back to the truth generating stage, back to the, sort of earlier in the process, rather than saying, well, if you create a big FBI investigation right before an election, and then you sample at that moment, what happens to the election, and I think that's just sort of bad sampling. It's bad data at some point, if you're not really capturing the will of what people would think over time. So that's sort of
kind of making me wish we had Audrey Tang in this discussion. There's a whole thing that they did in Taiwan where they had basically public debate where they, with some tools that were produced in part by a company called Polis, that basically allowed people to, basically put forth assertions and discover whether people agreed with their assertions or not, and to try to kind of come to consensus, exactly as you say, other than during a vote. Hey, Farhad, are you in touch with Audrey?
I'm in touch with Radical Exchange, and I can get to her very easily.
Yeah, we should maybe invite some more people, and have figure out who else should be in this discussion, and have a revisit in a month or a few weeks when we've kind of rounded up a few more of the really interesting people. I'm not saying that you're not interesting, but actually, I really want, Jamie, I want you to demo your system for us.
Okay.
But,
yeah, sure.
I posted in Audrey Tang's, I believe, the digital social innovation talk she gave at Radical Exchange. I think she gave a similar talk. I missed a session at TED this year, but I think she gave a similar talk there. But it's quite an awesome set of principles and actions that the Taiwan has taken to be able to enable, a much more engaged and participatory democracy. I mean, and I haven't been there to see it, but it looks like their response to COVID was an indication of how they do things and how they get people involved.
Yeah. Well,
I was going to add in that there are all these interlinking, and you did such a fantastic job of enumerating even each one of them is hours and hours of discussion. But if I feel there's a simple lack of good choices right now, and that the system is so kind of rigged with it's kind of like frozen up that it seems like there are sort of two huge groups of people. There's 100 million people who are eligible, not voting. A lot of them young digital natives. And then there's sort of left and right kind of lesser of two evil types who say voting is, I have to vote, so I'm going to hold my nose and pick one side or the other. And, there's 63 million red last election, 2016, 66 million blue. So blue has their undies bunched up that they won the popular vote, but not the election. But if you ask those people who are red or blue, I would bet, 40 of those 60 million might be voting lesser of two evils, so you have some ridiculous number of people that I would think would become very energized if there was an on-ramp or some way to get candidates in that elected that were sort of not, lesser of two evil types that were purely sort of citizen type candidates that seem like they come from a different angle.
so Farhad, would you be interested in talking about what you're trying to do with the Good Party, or is that
I would of course I would be interested in talking about it, but I don't want to hijack
well, just a very brief, because it does seem to me you are addressing a piece of
absolutely. The overview of what we're doing here is that we feel that I'm a technologist by background, built various technologies. The last one was this thing called Flipagram, where we got all the rights to the music to put with short videos. We sold that to ByteDance, and that's what you see as TikTok. Apologies for the little bit of a mess there. We don't own TikTok, obviously. I just built the tech and got the rights. But now, focusing on what I feel technology has done, good or bad. I think we've now got 4 of the 5 rights on the First Amendment. We've always had the freedom of religion or freedom of ideas, the freedom to say those ideas. The freedom of press came along with the internet, and press, as you were saying, everyone now can publish anything. And things like TikTok are ideal publishing, meme publishing platforms as well. And then the right to assembly is these social graphs of Twitter and social media. TikTok again has that as well. You can assemble 100, 1,000 million followers and push your ideas out to them. The last of those rights is the right to petition your grievances to the government, and the most powerful petition we have is the vote. Nobody has really built the technological equivalent of a Twitter or a blogger for voting, and that's what we're building with the Good Party. We're not building it as a commercial entity. We're building it as a public, good, free, open source software. I think the idea there is, how do you take these ideas that are out there, that these people can have, anybody can have them, assemble supporters around them that social media and other things allow people to do, and some of these greater sort of upset politicians, Jamal Bowman and others, are assembling nice followings on Twitter. But then how do you take those supporters and that turn them into voters, so that they know, and the politician knows, or the person running knows, and everybody kind of knows that whether they should vote for this person or not. So we're creating a sort of a Kickstarter for every campaign, where you see how many people are likely voters that are registered and ready to vote, and how many votes we need to win this election. And then you decide if you should vote for this person or not. So kind of opening up that last layer and to technology, and allowing people to see, get excited by, socially get more people involved, and hopefully get them to the polls and vote. Now, we're late for this election cycle. We're gonna, hopefully have 1 or 2 races where we can jump in and test this end to end. We don't even have all of the the registration piece in there yet, but we're in it for the long haul. This is going to be my life's work. So the Good Party is what it is. It's open source. So if any of you guys are interested in it, I'd love to have you guys take a look at it and talk to you more about it. But I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, can I just say one thing that I thought was very interesting? I just met Farhad recently and got the overview, but in a way, it's sort of like a turbocharged ranked choice voting, in which you take, for example, rather than you just vote at the end, you're voting all the way through, from one election to the next, in order to build the slate. So in some sense, it's building the choice in from the beginning, rather than you just get to pick from the menu. So effectively, you're trying to build coalitions over time. In some ways,
you're building as candidate voting block. So the voting block, let's say you need 250,000 people. Actually, let's pick a good one. 270,000 people will kick Pelosi out. There's a guy, Shahid Buttar, who's fighting, her. And I'm not picking. I'm not red or blue. I'm neither. So I'm happy to kick them all out. But 270,000 votes are needed. Shahid is, has 130,000 people support him on social media. He doesn't know how many of those people are voters in his district or not. But they should be able to register, be able to tell. We know he's going to get a certain amount of likely voters anyways, but he should be able to build his following up and likely voters up. If he doesn't get to 270, there's no point for anybody to do anything. Might as well.
Right. So you're basically getting rid of the spoiler vote problem by saying, okay, we actually have been able to measure the size of the support. In some ways, it's analogous to what Paulus and Audrey Tang were doing around ideas and policies, which is you build the consensus over time, and you're doing it you're trying to do it for people.
But when I was talking to him and saying, so we're late for this session, and we're probably you're not gonna take her out, and I'm not sure it's a good idea in this environment. But you're very early for 2022, and so if you're at 180,000 right now, that's terrible for this session. But you're 180,000 in for next time, December 4th. You can just keep November 4th, so you can keep going.
Of course, the question is, do we turn it into a popularity contest? And in fact, it turns out to be bad for democracy. But
one other question there would be too: how do you account for the fact that there may or may not be alignment between the people participating online versus the people that exist in the electorate? That to me is always the big challenge with these.
What do you mean by alignment?
Well, there's going to be a certain number of people that are going to participate in online environments, and particularly in things like this that seem like good technological democratic advancements. But then when you compare that to the electorate as a whole, that's a different population that may or may not have any interface with this at all.
We saw that with Bernie's campaign.
Absolutely,
right?
And I feel like Twitter is a very good example of online radicalization that doesn't necessarily align with reality. And that's a concern. I'm not saying what you're doing doesn't have a lot of value. That would be something you would need to error correct into it.
This is the election that where 37% of the voting population are digital natives of the eligible voting population, according to Pew, and 37 are boomer and older. So 1981 or younger is 37%, and 1964 and older are also 37%. And so participation is higher in the older generation right now than the younger. But the idea is that this is going to become, obviously it's these curves are intersecting, and the younger are going to become more and more part of this thing. So the notion is, how do you have a way to organize this growing number of kind of non-participating but valid members of society, into and get them excited about voting, and I think that's the big long arc of this, is that over time they will be the whole population, and that's over 10 years. It's not over.
Yeah, I like this idea of only sort of putting them up if they have a chance of winning, because I remember some analysis that independent candidates take from Democrats at like 3 or 4x. There's a big multiplier, so it definitely, the two-party contest is more it's disrupted in a non-uniform way, so.
So I wonder if I can jump in, because it sounds like a lot of the conversation is about, how do we get the participation we want, given that we're in a representative democracy where you have to elect politicians, and that's the main way. But if we can go up a level of abstraction, we can think of government as like serving three functions: figuring out what the will of the people is, executing on that will, and then like resolving disputes between people. That's the legislative, executive, and judicial branch. But if we're focusing on this first discussion point that Jamie has laid out for us, it's like, how do we understand the will of the people? And right now we understand the will of the people through our national discourse, which plays out in the media, and with debates that happen every 2 or 4 years between politicians. And that creates kind of a situation where most of the citizenry is kind of on the sidelines, and we root for our team, and we might get more or less involved, but there's actually very little we can do except vote. And I believe wholeheartedly that people should vote, but I also believe wholeheartedly that this is literally the least responsibility that the government can give us over our own self-governance. And so when I look at this question of how to determine the will of the people, what I've been working on for the last 5-6 years, and I've been studying this stuff for 20 years, it's definitely my life's work, is like, how do we get people involved directly in the media conversations? And how do we get people to deliberate directly about what's important to them at various levels of government? So at the Goodley Labs, we've been working on 2 projects. One of them is not going to be ready for another couple of years, but one of them we're launching next week. And it's called Public Editor. And it allows anybody to, what Public Editor does is it finds the most shared articles on the internet, and it has people kind of come together as a crowd and assess the credibility of the content within that news article, searching for over 40 types of misinformation. They could be argumentative fallacies, inferential mistakes, cognitive biases, etc. And then it labels the specific information in the article so that as people read their news articles, they can see, oh, this is a false dilemma. They can see this is an appeal to authority. This is a problem with selection effects, and this sample is biased. Like very, very specific labels on the specific words that are committing those errors. So you're training the population in media literacy as you're interrupting the misinformation in its tracks. So that's one model. Another project we're doing, the same page, is about getting people to deliberate. But in general, I think we need to be using the same technology we use to argue with our friends and family, like on Facebook and Twitter and stuff like that. We need to be using that, taking that technology and repurposing it for these particular functions of government. And the one I'm talking about now is just like figuring out the will of the people, and letting that be something that people do directly, not through representatives.
If I may on that, I think, tools like that are very useful, and you have to think about, sort of who you're going to reach with that. I think that people who are in general willing to participate in, fact-checking conversations and looking for logical fallacies are kind of already in the choir, as it were.
Yeah.
And reaching the people who are perhaps most at risk of, being disrupted by disinformation and misinformation is a bigger challenge. And I think that the media landscape that we talk about and the media conversations are so warped by various kinds of disinformation, misinformation, sovereign attacks, money, a whole variety of factors that are warping that conversation. It seems to me like one of the things I mentioned in the Discord chat was this idea that we have a whole lot of people that are undergoing radicalization of one kind or another, and it may be very early stages, but you see signs of it in your friends and family, people who are like, well, maybe hydroxychloroquine is a good drug. I don't know. Why should I be told what to think? And then the next thing you've got people, retweeting, Charlie Kirk and Candace Owens and, Kim Klacik and going down the rabbit hole. And in my mind, that's a symptom of a sick society, one that is got a ongoing endemic illness that needs to be looked at from a information system standpoint. How do we keep people from slipping down into those rabbit holes and becoming further and further radicalized to the point where you simply can't have consensus, you can't have reasoned conversation. No amount of fact checking can pull those people out of these cultish, social rabbit holes, which is really what they are. They're falling into this not because they necessarily believe something, but because they're getting social identity value from belonging to a group. and from, you know, developing a social identity around rebelling against some other perceived enemy that they've been told not to like. So to me, I mean, that's just kind of what I'm doing 24/7 right now. So I see that as the bigger problem in the rearview mirror, as it were. But I know, you know, there are a lot of different moving parts to this problem, and even us trying to get at many of them in an hour is tough. But that to me is kind of where I see the biggest issues.
Well, to
Yeah,
go
it's
with
almost
your
like,
metaphor, sorry, I'll stop talking after this. To go with your metaphor, Dave, like, you know, I agree there are people who won't be interested at all. There are people who aren't interested in wearing masks. But if you can start to get some people wearing masks and people see other people wearing masks,
Yeah, it's
you know,
a good
it starts
thing
to make
for
a
sure.
difference. It starts to make
Absolutely.
I think part of the issue, Nick, is to what extent do we advance by appeals to reason and data, and how does that stand up against appeals to emotion? You know, and in fact, you know, we have a lot of evidence from our politics that more information does not actually help people make better decisions, because so much of what people do when they make decisions is fundamentally irrational. And the idea that if only people were given more information, they would make better decisions, I worry that that's actually just a premise that's not borne out by the facts.
Well,
Tim, I agree. But before I hear the responses from the experts, I'd love actually to just expand that question a little bit and ask. So obviously there are people being radicalized, and it's like it's scary. It's legitimately scary. But do we actually know, and how can we know exactly how much influence misinformation and disinformation have? Like we see obviously like the kind of the big scary loud examples, but like to what extent does it actually move the elections, and then to Tim's point, like to what extent is it modifiable by these various strategies?
right. So I think that it's difficult to assess, and we could spend time debating about the potential impact and the range of impact that misinformation could have, or we could just assume a premise for like a hypothetical or a stand-in weight for that problem to discuss like potential solutions. But I do agree with you that like actually assessing the weight and impact of misinformation, what kind of impacts that has, is really important, because otherwise the solution we may be ideating on is not useful. But back to what Tim and what the discussion was before, I personally think that it is incredibly important to make emotional appeals to a mass population. However, I do believe that like the Cambridge Analytica campaigns for critical thinking and the new like mass marketing movements should be based on a thorough examination of what people think on a specific issue. So getting back to what Nick was saying, and I'm actually a really big fan of Nick's tools, being able to appropriately and accurately assess the will of the people, like having an actual true representation of what people think and where their values are and why they think a certain thing is right or important, is incredibly important in developing the new communication media tools to respond back to those things. So this is like a persistent debate in the digital democracy and digital debate groups that I'm a part of, because there's many like debate mapping programs. Like I think my organization would fall into debate mapping. And there's many groups that think that if we just aggregate all this information and present it, that's going to change the world. And I don't believe that's true. I do not believe the world will change with logic in this way. I do believe it has to be through story and narrative and charisma and enthusiasm and inspiration and gimmicks. However, I think the only ethical and responsible way of coming up with those gimmicks and those messages is after like truly inquiring into what could possibly be true. Like instead of me just trusting this one particular fact checker who said hydroxychloroquine has been found by multiple scholarly articles to not be effective, really look into, well, why are so many people saying that it could potentially be effective? And like, where is the logic not lining up? Because what my organization does is we unpack all of those claims, and we found that like, oh, this fact checker relied on a blog post by a university that conflated the discussion section of a scholarly article that just happened to have the most, the largest group of participants in that particular study. However, they completed the study by saying this was a non-randomized trial, and we need to have randomized control trials in order to come up with a conclusion. Therefore, we can't say whether it's harmful or beneficial. And yet the fact checker didn't rely on the scholarly article. They relied on a blog post that was written by somebody else that conflated the conclusion. So I think it's valid that people I think there's validity in what everyone really has to say. And I think we have to unpack those things.
I also just want to add that I don't think this stuff has truly been tested, Tim. You know, like,
Yeah.
I agree with you that if I show someone some false piece of information, there's a decent chance they're not going to go read another article. They're not going to go read some debunk that tries to identify the original mistake and then correct that original mistake. But if there's a label on the mistake in the moment that they're reading it, the chances of them believing that are lower. The chances of them having doubt about its truth value are much higher. And that's just, we have literally not had that technology before and haven't had the ability to even test its efficacy.
Nick, as I said on the private channel, I mean, I worked on this problem a while, and I think one of the issues that I would, a question to ask is, how do you distribute those labels? Because and how do you get the information out to the people in a way that's credible? Because the news organizations, we did this thing called dot spots, 2007. To dots were distributed objects of thought. The idea being that if you could annotate the news with these wikis that were like Reddit little things and people can edit and say what is on there, then you could really do a good job. It was actually Tristan Harris of the Center for Humane Technology was working on a similar technology called Aperture that he sold to Google. And so we were in that space of annotations in 2007 and how do you get, wisdom of crowds on annotations and onto the news and things like that. What I was surprised, to learn the hard way was that we had all this wonderful technology that we built and did incredible things, but the news organizations could care less about it. They were not interested in putting stuff on, that would, if it didn't generate revenue for them, they were not interested. The publisher's in charge of that thing, and the publisher is looking for the most salacious, crazy, types of stuff to get your attention. And as Tim said, it's sort of, if it bleeds, it leads kind of mentality that is that dominates the media landscape. So having the tools and having the discourse and having the labels is great, but how do you get those labels in front of people in a way that they care and they're willing to dig into and spend more time, on where people are reading the tweet headline and then forwarding it on,
So there are two ways, and I want to be mindful that I'm taking up a lot of space in the conversation. So let me answer this and give Jamie an opportunity to switch us into some other space. But there are two ways. We have a news feed where people can just see the articles, and I actually put a link to that into the chat, or three ways I should say. Another way is that we have a Google Chrome extension, so that if you're at the New York Times and you're reading an article, you can click on our extension and then you can see the labels on the article. And then a third way is that we can actually scan through social media and we can see what people are talking about and which articles are coming up in particular conversations and reply directly to those. And we're doing that semi-automatically now, but we're looking to have a bot that will do that automatically so that we're intervening in conversations where disinforming articles are being shared.
So Jamie, can you demo what your system at all?
Right now?
Yeah, like right now. Just do a screen share.
Okay.
I mean only if you want to. I just think it'd be cool to see it.
Well, I've done these presentations before, and I like to set up like all of the tabs to walk through, because it's not all one integrated system. This is where we do this work, and it moves over to this section and here and here and here and here. So I'll awkwardly like be going through files.
Future session then, maybe a future.
I would love to do that. I would love to do that in a future session. But I also wanted to ask if there's a group of people here who are convinced that the tight feedback loop with I think it was vTaiwan, Polis had created the underlying technology for vTaiwan. If people in this group were considering that the tight feedback loop between government articulating its understanding of the people's will and putting forth policy and the actual feedback of the public, if I'm not mistaken, the population of Taiwan is less than 10 million. And yet the United States has like 320 million people. So I would be interested to discuss more about how we think it could be possible to scale up that mechanism of how could government communicate with the public and the public be able to give feedback in order to create that generative, iterative conversation about policy.
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that. I do think that the kind of like the thing that Polis did that struck me as super interesting was, you can't argue over this topic. You simply have to make a different assertion and see if it gets support. And it's kind of, again, I'm kind of intrigued by the fact that it's that, you know, that Farhad, what Farhad is doing with the Good Party is sort of similar. You know, it's like you just have to put forward candidates and see if they get support. And, you know, it's just like you really can say anything, and then you kind of go, no, actually people don't sign on to that. You know, and again, it may have whole other levels of discord, you know, where it does not work, but it's very different than what we have today.
There's a little Trojan horse in this too, and it's a little tricky. So if you are able to get people excited enough about this candidate voting block, so there's 200,000 of them in a district to get something done, it also becomes this candidate knows that they got in because of this hack. They didn't get in because of money or special interests or other things. They got in for this. So that those 200,000 people can then have a connection with this candidate, and you can take 1,000 of them and then force them through, not force them, call them into civic jury duty, I would say, like call upon them to come and actually take a look at the details of some proposal or something, using some tools, knowing that, you know, their 20 hours of service here is going to go actually into policy, and you're getting real people, 20,000 hours of real people time into this. You know, but they're just 1,000 people out of 200,000.
Well, that's kind of like deliberative polling. Do we know anybody in that world? Because I think deliberative polling is kind of interesting as a whole. You know, it's like, hey, you know, you don't ask people who don't know anything. You ask people after they've studied it what they think. You know, and I think there's been some interesting stuff in Europe. You know, the Irish abortion. You know. Decision was, you know, driven by a process.
Jamie knows about this stuff.
I was just going to say the most familiar there's a bunch of deliberative democracy projects, but the one that's been tied to actual voting mechanisms, the one I know of was My Vote, which is an Australian project. And I spoke to the founder. I don't know if I'm allowed per the rules of how we talk about things, but I spoke to someone at My Vote. And even though they had set it up so that people would micro vote, so you wouldn't vote on an entire policy, you would vote on aspects of the policy. So you would be making micro decisions. And so your cumulative vote at the end would be based on you agreeing with the nuances of a specific policy. And you could only vote on those nuances and make those micro decisions after you had read documentation that briefed you on this matter. And then you had to like take a test, like confirming that you did actually go through the material. And then they provided all of this other material. And when I spoke to that group, they didn't seem convinced that the extra material that they had given people was something that they were going through. I think it was like as little as 5% of people were actually like looking to be more informed, and they would only tolerate a certain like brief update of like both sides of that micro decision. So I don't know about online-based deliberative polling that's actually tied to voting mechanisms, but deliberative democracy mechanisms and like facilitating group conversation and dialogue, that seems to really carry people somewhere. But for as large a nation as the United States, I don't know how practically applicable that could be, especially with like federal elections.
One thing, random selection of people into a deliberative jury is also quite important, because a lot of times, you know, you have people who have an agenda. Lobbyists are a good example of people who have an agenda and are very, very good at convincing people of their, you know, fair and balanced view of the world that happens to skew, you know, one way. And, you know, and so I think that that's another piece that you have to worry about when you're trying to think about how to pull a large group of people on, or what you're doing, or who's participating in participatory deliberations and things like that. So that's another reason for this idea for civic jury duty.
Farhad, I know you worked a bit with Glenn Weil on quadratic voting. That's another whole thing of just like give people like a budget for voting, and you can kind of vote 1,000 on something, and you can vote, and then you use up your vote. So that's kind of a way of kind of tying it to issues.
Yep,
How strongly
it's super interesting stuff. Again, the problem, you know, is sort of the UI, in my opinion, the user experience of quadratic voting, and how how complex it is for the average person to kind of use. So that's where I've been, working a little bit with Glenn on it. And I think, but as a mechanism, absolutely much better than one, just a straight, simple vote. It's a nice mechanism if you guys are familiar with it.
Farhad, have you looked at any of the systems that have tied quadratic voting to tokens? And there's like drip tokens, and you build up your budget and then you spend it. Have you?
I haven't because I'm working at the more fundamental level of this can we even engage people in the simple, there is a reason now again to engage because we can bring you a better choice,
Right.
38, the high level thing is 38 million, write-ins would get Bernie in, like that kind of thing. But it isn't enough time for that, but it is, you can organize and do things at scale on the internet that's different and it's simple. That's the part that I'm working on, and I kind of step back a little bit on the more sophisticated stuff for now, because see if this doesn't work, then okay, then we got to work on other things. But if this works, then there's a lot of things that open up from it.
Can I ask a question? I mean, something you just said, if we get 38 million people, we get Bernie in. What if Bernie gets in and he doesn't know how to govern?
Right.
That's kind of like Jimmy Carter had great values. He didn't know how to actually run the system.
Yeah, well, I think the first wave of people coming in from the good party side are not going to be as savvy with the political levers as a sort of a Pelosi or a Schumer or McConnell. And in some ways that's a good thing. In some ways it's not. The path in, if you can imagine, an ordinary person coming from left field and coming in and getting someone out, and also these people we would hope would have a transparency camera. We have a whole lot of plans if you will make it in, but they would, the notion that this is happening and can happen, and now there's a different path into the political system, is overwhelmingly positive in my opinion, given where we're at today and the hopelessness of everything. Now, how would we then prepare people better to, or have better prepared folks? That's another thing that absolutely needs to be addressed. It isn't, but I think hope and a credible plan is what is needed, or a credible plan that gives hope is what is needed to mobilize a hell of a lot of people into becoming more active. If we can do that, I think exciting things might happen. If we can't, then we're sort of stuck in this weird lesser of two evils, and the lesser of two evils keep getting more evil to just, maybe just.
Well, I guess the question I have is just to what extent, if we have a personality-driven politics, our politics traditionally rejects people who are competent. Like you look, like people who get up there who kind of are very, again, you need sometimes that you have that combination of they're able to win and they're able to figure out how to apply policy. Like I, for example, I look at Bernie and I look at Elizabeth Warren, and I think, both have progressive values, but I think Elizabeth Warren, if she had been, had won, would have been actually had plans, whereas Bernie didn't really have plans. He just had aspirations. And I kind of feel like, how do we build a system where we select for competence because, and a lot of it is actually getting in there and figuring it out. And I see this a lot from even in, regardless of political orientation, we have a big complex machine to run, to govern, a country of 320 million people. And, and we don't really have a system for figuring out how we get those competent people.
Right now our political system actually is set up, our electoral system says, let's get people to fight for votes, and whoever fights the best, that's who we actually put up into power, as opposed to, let's have an electoral process that shows coalition building or something like that. Yeah. But we don't even have to have, with the technology we have right now, we don't even really need to have politicians. We could plausibly, we might for a transition stage, but we could plausibly have like a really vast, federated, deliberative online legislature that people can use in the boardroom, or they can use in their town or city or state, or even at a federal level. And then you just run candidates who are committed to promoting the highest priorities of that online deliberative system, of that online direct legislature.
That's literally what I did my TEDx talk on, is replacing politicians with essentially databases. Comparing politicians to outdated technology. And like literally it was instead of needing a newspaper boy to like scream into the streets, like a news crier, now everyone has Twitter. So if we're really expecting a politician to be able to absorb and critically understand the point of view of potentially millions of their constituents, that's just out of control. That's just not feasible at all. However, like millions of people could contribute their ideas about a specific policy that could be held in a database. And then a group of curators like my organization maps this content, so we can say, okay, what are the focal points here in terms of value conflict? What are the arguments people are putting forth to support this assertion? And then we can do the due diligence of actually deconstructing the logic and fact checking and gathering evidence and building up a robust not only representation of what people think, but doing the critical analysis work that probably won't otherwise happen in public deliberation settings in a coordinated and centralized way. Part of my organization, what we do is we're taking all the deliberations that are already happening. So when two people are debating on CNN about something, when there's a book that's published about something, there's websites and social media spats, we're looking for where are these conversations happening and pulling them together to integrate them into one database and then creating a visual map of that. So and I could get into that when I present my stuff, because there's actually really interesting stuff about the emergent structure of society-wide conversation. But Nick, I totally agree with you that the politician, if we think of them as technology that was necessary back when we needed someone to ride a horse to go deliver a message, how could the representative role be replaced with technology? And potentially, how could the public policy producing engine also be replaced with process or technology potentially also? Like there's certain elements of being a politician that can't be replaced, like congressional hearings and things like that, people knowing how the machinery works, upholding law through inquiry through congressional hearings. But producing legislation and representation especially, I think, could be replaced by databases and strict processes.
It'd be amazing if we could get the populace to focus directly on issues and what they care about, what the issues and policies they care about, instead of trying to choose this avatar that represents a whole portfolio of issues.
Yeah,
I'm right there with you, Jamie.
There's the whole thing about unbundling, politics. I've had this conversation with Misha Chellam. It's like one of the big issues that we have is we have a bunch of separate issues that tend to be bundled. And in our technology world, we've seen time and again that change really happens with bundling and with unbundling, and we haven't really unbundled politics. I think it'd be super interesting to unbundle politics from parties and from people, and try to make new coalitions.
The system won't change itself. It's a locked duopoly. This political industrial complex is kind of in this locked battle of pointing fingers and not cooperating. So you have to figure out a way to get, into this system with this set of kind of votes. They're not going to go for liquid democracy. They're not even letting vote by mail. So you have to get in. And then change the rules, not hope what if the rules were different, or how, because that isn't going to happen by itself. So that's
Has anyone ever tried running on a platform of like, I'm going to vote in the legislature according to a liquid democracy? Like you vote for me and I will be like your proxy?
That has been done. No one's been voted in, but those campaigns have been run. Those campaigns have been run.
Run on a good party, please.
I don't remember what those groups were, but I think in California and Colorado, there were a few groups being put forth. And actually my vote, which operates in Australia, and I think also Democracy Earth, they were trying to do US-based campaigns, and I think they fled to other countries because it wasn't working out so well. But there's been attempts for that. And here's a cool thing too, is that like something that we all need to grapple with is that like any one of us can produce policy and legislation, and we just need to find the representative that will introduce it and then create the external public pressure to call these representatives and bully them into actually voting, right? So it is possible to make systemic changes while not being in the system yourself, as long as you can build out that external public pressure to give politicians the impression that if they don't vote or pass this specific thing, that we're going to be very displeased and they won't have their jobs back. And anyone can really make policy, which is fabulous.
Well, that's kind of what happened with the Green New Deal in some ways. You know, they got people in on that basis. I mean, not that exclusive, but someone like AOC, I think the Sunrise Movement did a pretty good job of that.
Unfortunately, it didn't get passed. And what's really interesting is I think the Green New Deal is 438 claims. And 438 claims is a lot of assertions of truth for someone to pass on without any evidence being presented. So I think AOC did say that like the rollout of the Green New Deal wasn't the best rollout or something that she particularly wanted. And I think perhaps in part that it's because the sense-making part for the community was missing. Unless people had immediately bought into the premise. It's much like watching an inconvenient truth. When I have my students doing deconstruction, for students who don't assume that climate change is catastrophic, if you start watching an inconvenient truth and you see like exploding volcanoes and destroying buildings, you're not immediately enrolled in that premise and you're like, whoa, this is alarmist. Like, why is there exploding buildings and volcanoes? That's crazy. And so I think the same with any type of policy like that is that there also needs to be the sense-making, evidence-based part of the legislation. It's not just, we want this change to happen and you should assume that we're right, but here's the actual body of legislation that doesn't have evidence. Sometimes there are findings as a part of a piece of legislation where it establishes the reasoning and evidence for why the subsequent legislation is valid, but that's not always there. But yes, just like you mentioned, Sunrise Movement, they created this policy and got AOC in with Justice Democrats to actually introduce it. And it didn't move, but that's not to say it can't happen next time.
But your point about the size of legislation, I think, is a really good point. I've kind of talked about that back when I was working on the open government stuff. One of my canonical examples was the largest infrastructure project in U.S. history. The National Highway System Act of 1956 is like 19 pages long. The ACA, 1,800 pages. We've basically gotten into this system of micromanagement by this committee, by all these lobbyists, rather than bang, here's a statement of what we're going to do. We're going to figure out the details later. And, we went somewhere really wrong in the last 50 to 70 years in this sort of whole process of massively over-specifying policy up front.
Well, that's the difference between like a resolution and a bill, I think. Yeah, is that like, and I think the Green New Deal was a resolution. It was just saying, because these social ills exist, we resolve to take these actions. When a bill is like, to make sure the government doesn't bleed money from everywhere, we need to specifically say who is responsible for doing what, when, like, must this be done, given like when this act is published, etc. So I can understand the balance, but perhaps the resolution aspect of putting forth policy should be more expedited and not as necessarily detailed, but I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we're over time now.
All right, well, thank you so much. Great discussion, and so many, I've actually ordered 3 books in the course of the conversation, and queued up a bunch of tabs to read.
Well,
really great comments from everyone. I just want to say, like, we have all these ideas about what democracy is and what it can be, but we have new technology that could actually shift things. And I respect the political scientific knowledge in the room, but let's know that we haven't actually tested everything that's possible yet. And I'm sorry for saying so much. Thank you, Jamie. What a wonderful session.
Thanks, Jamie.
Nick, you're awesome. Everyone's awesome. Farhad, it was nice learning about your project as well.
Thank you.
So
please.
cheers, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.